Great. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to today's session. My name's Alex. I'm the Exec Director and Head of Advisory here at LGBT Great. I'm delighted to be joining you today to talk about inclusive language on this National Coming Out Day. So happy National Coming Out Day. If anyone's come out today, good stuff. Joined by Shreyas. Shreyas, do you want to give a quick intro for the folks?
Hey, Alex. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully, everyone can hear me. I feel like my internet's not doing very well.
You're good.
Okay, thanks. That's good. Welcome, everyone. I'm Shreyas. My pronouns are he, they, and yeah, happy National Coming Out Day. And yeah, I'm very glad that everyone's joined us. I am the Insights and Content Analyst at LGBT Great, and I do everything around data, research, and training.
Fab, good stuff. Okay, so today the conversation focuses on language. It's something that we all are using right now. We are faced with every day in written format. We consume language in auditory and visual. There's so much of our day that is kind of informed by language, whether we realize it or not, consciously or unconsciously. And today we wanted to spend a little bit of time with you talking about what inclusive language means, why it matters, and then sharing with you a few resources and some thoughts from our side on how organizations, leaders, teams can integrate more inclusive approaches to language in their day-to-day, but also in formal comms as well. For those that don't know us, we are LGBT Great. We are I would say small but perfectly formed member organization and consulting firm, focusing on supporting predominantly financial services, but increasingly broader businesses in professional services and wider in becoming more LGBTQ plus inclusive and friendly. We do that through a range of different products and services. You can see a few of them on the screen there. We have kind of standard membership, which includes a load of great content, materials, engagement opportunities. We have our newly launched careers platform, which is a talent attraction, specifically looking at LGBTQ plus talent across financial services and more broadly. So it's a platform for organizations and for talent. So if you're interested in that, get in touch. Our head of careers, Claire Scott, I think is on the line. So she's, I'm sure, giving a wave. But if you are interested in getting in touch, then please do. And then finally, we have our advisory service line, which is essentially more of our bespoke consulting engagements. And we look at transformation programs, DEI data, and in many instances, language. So yeah, today we're going to walk you through some of the thoughts we have here. And then I know you're all probably thinking, where's the guide? I want the guide. Give me the content. Fear not, anyone who joins this call will be sent the full LGBTQ plus inclusive language guide that we have. We'll talk a little bit about exactly what you're getting. And this will be launching next Wednesday on International Pronouns Day. So you'll be seeing that in your inboxes landing next week. But today we're going to talk you through a little bit of what is in that guide, share with you some thoughts on inclusive language principles, and then look at some LGBTQ plus inclusive language trends around the world. That's the spiel. Please do feel free to ask any questions in the Slido. You'll get the link up in a minute. We haven't turned the Q&A or chat function on in Zoom because some people struggle with Zoom, some organizations don't like it, etc., etc. So please direct all your questions through Slido. But first, we thought it might be quite a nice idea just to really understand who's on the line today. We're all speaking English, so I presume all of us, or at least have some level of English capability. But I don't know about you, but I also speak other languages. I speak German and Italian. That's what I did at university. I suppose hence why, if you want my credentials, that's why I'm able to talk to you about this today. Later, I'll be sharing with you some thoughts specifically on German and Italian, so I can talk you through those in great detail. But yes, we have a poll for you, which hopefully should work. So if everyone can just scan the QR code or click that link, and if you could potentially share with us, besides English, which languages do you speak? We are doing this because we are other languages. Excellent. So we're starting off strong, some Spanish. Hola to all the Spanish speakers. My Spanish is not very good. So, but what we're doing essentially is trying to capture a perspective on what languages are there around? And these are, business common languages. Can see the French speakers, Spanish speakers, German, Chinese, great. The reason that we're kind of interested is because we are going to focus on business English today in the conversation around inclusive LGBTQ plus language, but there are so many other languages that we are faced with every day. And the second phase of our work on this topic will be looking at in a lot more detail what LGBTQ plus inclusive language looks like around the world. So for those speakers here, we will be coming to you with an opportunity to engage on what LGBTQ plus inclusive language looks like in your language. So hopefully you'll be keen to get involved with that. But I can see lots of French and other languages. Very interesting. It's a bit nebulous. Other languages, there's probably quite a lot there. So I'll be interested to learn a bit more about what it is you speak. I can see we have Q&A working as well. It only allowed one selection. I see. Thanks. Apologies for that. So people are speaking multiple languages, I see as well, which is great. Okay, so LGBTQ plus inclusive language is what we're talking about today. So that will involve gender. It will also cover off aspects around sexuality and navigating the world as a queer person. Queer is a term that we might want to be talking about in a bit as well. In this, there is quite a lot to say, really. And one of the things that I wanted to get a bit of a pulse check with everyone here today is how confident do you currently feel in articulating LGBTQ plus inclusive aspects in English? Obviously, we're all talking English, and apologies that they only let you select one language. I know we've clearly got some multilingual polyglots with us today. But yes, interesting. Pretty good, I would say. I mean, there's some confident people here, so I'm expecting some great questions to come through and for people to be highly engaged when we open out some opportunities for further engagement afterwards. But some people, 2 and 3 as well. So hopefully today will give you, if you're in that kind of under 5 zone, some tips and tricks. And if you're in that 6 to 10 zone, hopefully some thoughts around how you could lead the conversation with others. Because I think if you're sitting in that 7, 8, 9, 10 zone, then I'd be looking to you to be leading some of these types of conversations internally with your teams as well. Okay, 6.5. I think that's pretty close to the middle. So that's good. Thank you, everyone. The next poll I have for you is then thinking about those other languages that so many of you speak, and thinking about that language or languages you mentioned earlier. Appreciate there's only one option here, but overall, how confident are you in the LGBTQ plus inclusive aspects in those other languages? 61% saying 1. Okay, great. Well, Shrey, if there was a business case for the global language profiles that we are putting together around inclusive language in a more broadly than business English, I think that is just it. So that's really interesting, Shrey. What are your thoughts on that?
No, literally the same, because I was like seeing this question, I was also thinking the fact that I have such a hard time being very inclusive in Hindi and Bengali. And it's kind of ironic because that's what I grew up with.
Yeah.
It just says a lot, right? But yeah, and I think it's much easier in business English. But yeah, definitely. That's the business case right there.
Yeah, that's a business case. That's for that. I think that's really funny. So we went from 6.5 in English to 2.4 in those other languages. So yeah, 28 of you sharing your thoughts there. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've set a bit of a tone for this in that I think it's pretty fair to say that these kind of conversations are helpful and useful and important, given that we're sat at that one for many of you. There's lots that you can do around language. There's training, there's documents, there's content, there's videos, there's websites, and if you go on Google and just type in inclusive language, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of results and stuff. But there are some a few specific opportunities that exist for organizations. Let's not forget that we're talking organizationally here, to support, and also for LGBT great to support. And so with that context in mind, that there's inclusive language, people are feeling more confident in English, but less in other languages. And generally, we'll talk about some of the principles in a minute. The final poll I have for you is which of the following would you find valuable in the context of these, inclusive languages in English or otherwise? Dedicated training around broad principles, dedicated training around inclusive language specifically, specific guidance around pronouns, guidance or documentation around inclusive language or company policies specifically, in-depth workshops focusing on inclusive language for socials. I don't know what everyone's role in your organization is. I'm sure we have people across the broad spectrum of business lines at senior leadership level, junior people. So I'm sure if you're interested in any of these specifically and would like any of LGBT Great's thoughts on how your organization could do this, we get in touch with me directly. I'll show you how to do that at the end today. Guidance and documentation around it's changing quite quickly, which is good. So people are using it. So dedicated training around best practices, guidance, specific guidance around pronouns. Okay, great. And it seems that policy is just pipping principles. You'll be pleased to know that the next slides I have are actually around principles, so we can tackle some of that today. In terms of company policies, that is a bit more challenging. There's a lot that LGBT Great can do to support you directly. Either, we can explore, reviewing policies. We can explore giving training on this type of thing. Once the language guide is out and available for all of you, I think that will hopefully form a great basis to have those discussions internally. And again, I'll be looking to those 7, 8, 9, and 10 submission people on English and LGBTQ plus inclusive language to drive some of that. Okay, thank you for indulging me in those, and thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. Really do appreciate it. Great to see the technology is also working. Okay, so LGBT Great, how can we help? How can we actually do some of that for you or with you? For those that know us, you know that we have a range of reports that are currently live. One of those is looking at trans and non-binary inclusion specifically, and does contain some aspects of linguistic elements around inclusive language, pronouns, etc. That's available to download on our website now. Shrey, would you mind just grabbing the link for that and sharing that with the folks? Thank you. So that's kind of what we currently have. This was the basis that we were working from for putting together this presentation and this kind of broader program of work. And we are delighted to be confirming that we'll be releasing 2 additional reports in this space. One of them I've already mentioned and you alluded to earlier, which is the LGBT Great Inclusive Language Guide, which focuses on kind of practical tips and elements. I'll talk about what that means in a moment. And we've got a subtitle here, Navigating LGBTQ plus inclusive language in an ever-changing world. So our goal is to try and build a bit of a foundation of inclusive language, give you some guiding principles, give you some broad stroke, practical tips that you could implement in written communications, in policy documentation, from a broad principles perspective. And then hopefully this will mean that you are able to engage with your stakeholders. If you're a senior leader, you can engage with your board or your exco, etc., on these topics. And if you're a junior member of the team, then hopefully that can help you with maybe some of the day-to-day work that you're doing. I'll pause. That's that one. So that will be out next week, as I mentioned, and everyone on this call will get a copy of that. The second piece of work we are launching will be in 2024. So do bear with us as we finalize this. And this will be essentially a toolkit, an appendix, if you will, to the main practical report. And this will be where we will be looking in detail at least 10 currently global languages, the common business languages, the ones that were offered on that first slide, so, French, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, German, etc., etc. There was lots of people who said other languages as well. There will be there scope for additional profiles in that kind of appendix, subject to how much engagement and we can get and how much information we can collate. If you're speaking, I don't know, if you're speaking Gosa or something, then it might be we definitely need your support because we don't have that knowledge. So I'm looking forward to hopefully working with some of people who said they spoke other languages beyond that list in that as well. Okay, so those are pieces of content that you will be getting from us either soon or quite soon. So stay tuned for those. Right, that's it. I'll pause. Shrey, anything from you on the intro? That was the intro. Now for the meat of the sandwich, or if you're vegan, the what have I said before? Falafel in the wrap or something. Don't shake your head. Yes, so for the rest of this presentation today, I wanted to share with you some of the content that will be in that guide that's releasing next week, particularly around the principles. And 50% of you who completed that survey earlier said that that's something that you're interested in. So hopefully that will be good and we'll scratch that itch that you had. And then we're going to share, Shrey and I, some of our thoughts around non-binary inclusive language. And in the context of Coming Out Day, maybe reflect on some of those coming out stories. I'm sure everyone likes to hear those. Finally, we will share with you a couple of examples of how some global languages, some languages around the world are tackling LGBTQ plus inclusive approaches, obviously slightly differently than we are in English. And so, yeah, then at the end of this presentation, there will be just a summary of what you can do to get involved. And if you are interested in providing any thoughts or feedback on the language that you speak, there will be a short form which will be in the Slido for you to complete, and then we will come calling to invite you to a workshop, webinar type online engagement to talk about the language that you speak. Okay. In drafting all of these types of documentation, the first thing you do is search for fun quotes that you think might make a slide like this look good. And the one that came to my mind immediately was this quote by Angela Carter. Language is power, life, and the instrument of culture, the instrument of domination and liberation. That's quite a big quote. There's quite a lot going on in there. I think, really at the top of this call, I should have said language is power, language matters, words impact those around you, words influence, they have the potential to harm, to do good, to change people's minds. Language really does have a strong role to play in the world. It's how we communicate our thoughts and feelings. So I think it's important when acknowledging that inclusive language is something that seeks to create a linguistic environment that is sensitive to people's differences, that promotes respect, and that the words we use do have power. They do have that potential to be the instrument of domination or the instrument of liberation. And that's why I think, inclusive language does matter, because language is that instrument. So that's kind of what I want you to think about a little bit as we go through this today, is that all of this may seem fluffy. It may at times seem abstract. It may seem, if you have never experienced any kind of language learning, if you've not looked at grammar, then it may feel a bit, oh, okay, well, it's a bit hard. But I think it's really important that whatever you can do, however you can move that dial around inclusive language, whether in an LGBTQ plus context or in another context, just moving that one step will have an impact, because the language that you're using in an inclusive fashion has power and is that instrument then hopefully of liberation and equality and respect. Shrey, anything from you to add before I get too emotional about this quote, because it does really speak to me?
Don't worry, I have my own quote prepared that I'm
Okay, you have your own quote prepared.
Yes.
Excellent. Great. Okay. So inclusive language, what is it all about? You may be sat there thinking, great, Alex, I speak all these languages, I'm confident, but tell me more about the principles that underpin those, this inclusive language. There is a lot of text on this slide. I did think about just providing the title of this here, but I thought actually I'd include the rest of the copy as well, just to give you a sense of what is in the language guide that we'll be sharing next week. We, Shreyas and I spent some time thinking about what is it actually that underpins inclusive language. We came up with 7 principles of inclusive language. The first is kind of, we talked a little bit about it already, is a kind of around respect, is around, taking the time to acknowledge difference and to adjust the language that you use in order to be respectful and, where possible, to be unbiased. I think that's, respect and elimination of biases where possible is, I think, a very good foundation for inclusive language. As part of that, many of us make assumptions all the time about people around us, what people look like, what people do, and that bleeds into the language we use. Later, we're going to talk about pronouns and non-binary and gender inclusive language. How many of you have seen someone from, I don't know, when standing in a queue or something, and we are British after all, and seen the back of their head and made, oh, well, that person is male or female, and then they've turned around and they've been not that. So, we made an assumption about that, and the language we would then have used to describe that person would have been inflected by that assumption. And that is not necessarily inclusive. That's not necessarily helpful. So, asking over assuming is another useful foundational principle in language. An old boss of mine used to say, if you assume, you make an ass of you and me. So that was something that was drilled into me in my previous job. So asking, with a foundation of respect and trying to eliminate biases is kind of where we start. Clarity and jargon free. I don't know about you. I love an acronym. I love an initialism. We're all, if you're joining in and you have a very corporate role, we love a bit of jargon. But inclusive language acknowledges that people may not actually know what that means. And so having, sorry, we just have some internal, yes, okay, sorry about that. In terms of clarity and jargon free, where possible, we avoid unnecessary jargon, or at least provide clear supporting documentation or explanation to ensure that language is clear and jargon free where possible. So respectful, based on finding out the information, and then as clear as possible are kind of the first three. I can see someone said that the chat function has been turned off. There we go. I've just turned that back on. Apologies. We have some platforms. We can't have everything right all the time. Okay, the next four. Centering on the person is something that if you've been to any DE&I language or indeed broader training, you may have come across as an idea. This says, a person who is, rather than saying so for example, you would say a person who is gay rather than saying gay. You would say, a trans person or trans man, etc., rather than a trans or a transgender, etc., which is not what we want to be saying. So centering on the person rather than the identifying aspect or dimension is in many instances preferable, not exclusively, but where possible, putting that emphasis on the person is always kind of preferable and does relate back to that aspect of respect, etc. Sensitive to context is a good one, I think. Language needs to adapt and change depending on the environment you're in. The classic case is, you speak in a boardroom differently than you would with your family, or different with your friends, or different with your team. So having a sensitivity to that, whether it's conscious or in many cases, is unconscious, but where it is conscious, changing the language you use, the words you use, the modes of speech, etc., is really important. So, in this session now, I probably won't be swearing a lot. If I was down the pub, maybe people around me would be swearing. Do you know what I mean? It's things like that. So inclusive language is specific to context. I'm not saying you should be swearing in the boardroom, although I'm sure many people do. In addition to context, I wanted to split out cultural context as well as kind of social context or physical context, because cultural nuances are really important as well. We've seen a lot of stuff happening in the US at the moment around trans non-binary inclusion. There's lots of words that culturally are different. So having a cultural aspect to this as well as a kind of contextual aspect is important. Shrey, do you want to come in on anything around cultural nuances? Because you and I have spoken a lot about this.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like what comes to my mind, and this is obviously from personal experience, is I am much more forgiving to people who are back home. And obviously English is not like their native language.
Yeah.
So I feel like English, obviously, because linguistic constructions over the world, depending on what like the parent language is, if it's like, for example, Romantic language, Germanic, based on Sanskrit, it's so different. So it's very hard to like reconcile the fact that, for example, my identity might be very interesting to someone back home who cannot really understand it in ways of Hindi, which I speak,
Mm-hmm.
and Bengali, or there's so many more languages. So I feel like the cultural nuance for me is that when I talk to someone who's like an English speaker, I am less forgiving in terms of like being like, oh yeah, you understood my pronouns. It's been
Mm-hmm.
7 times now. You got this is you can stop misgendering me now. But when I'm talking to someone in back home, I think it's very different for them because their language, like the level of their language, is still not as sharp.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is what for me, like that cultural nuance is where I'm more forgiving. And I try because I differentiate it by exactly, I think that's what the guide is about. It's not prescriptive or pedantic, but rather to understand the person's impact and intention and to make them understand what they can change to
Mm-hmm.
have a better impact and intention. Um, so I feel like that's where like the cultural nuance comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And I am like generally much more understanding when it comes to someone who's not an English speaker.
Mm-hmm.
And it is kind of sad that I speak English better than I speak my own languages. But yeah, anyway. um,
No, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I completely agree. The cultural nuance, I think, is important, with the types of words you use in the context in which you use them. But I think you're right, actually thinking about how is the language constructed, how does the language inform how you think, how you express yourself. I know, I mean, just when I speak Italian, I'm much more, gestural with my hands. When I speak German, I express myself in a much more structured fashion because I have to. That's what the constraints of the language demand. So, English, it can be very flowery, it can be very descriptive. Um, so, actually how the language is constructed influences how you navigate the world. We're going to talk about Japanese in a bit, and for any Japanese speakers on the line, I'm sure you're all aware, personal pronouns around how I refer to myself, with ore or watashi. So, in an impersonal sense, the watashi means I, as does ore, but ore has a very gendered, very masculine sense to it. So cultural nuances, I can express myself differently just by saying I am or I am Alex in Japanese as I can in English. So if you then say, okay, well, the dominant environment I'm in is an English environment, but people are, coming from different, environments or speak different languages as their first language, then we may actually have to be inclusive in a different way. We may have to acknowledge that and work with that, in a different way to ensure that people's perspectives or, the different modalities are expressed really. You mentioned prescriptive. In linguistics, there is the concepts of prescriptivism and descriptivism, which is basically that prescriptive means that language is always fixed and this is the right answer. It's right or wrong. There's no, gray area at all. Descriptivism is the notion that language is kind of always changing and is always in flux, and is all, think about all the new words that get added to the dictionary. Think about Googling, those sorts of things. 50 years ago, we wouldn't have said, oh, I'll Google that. It's things like that. So language is always being updated. The language, particularly in an LGBTQ plus context, is always kind of changing and evolving as people become more nuanced in how they express their identities, for example, or that common aspects of LGBTQ plus the communities, etc., become introduced into common parlance. So it's more common for people who are talking about pronouns. I think 20 years ago, if someone said, "What are your pronouns?" You'd go, I am a he, I think. I've heard people even have that reaction kind of, on, seen videos of that, etc. So descriptivism and remaining flexible here, which is principle 7 in the guide, is really the acknowledgement that language will change. So just by having an open mind to the fact that language can change and evolve, is, I think, kind of one of the final, if not the most important aspect of inclusive language. Um, okay, I'm going to pause. Shrey, any other thoughts from you on the principles?
No, yeah, like I completely believe the fact that like language is perpetually evolving. And I always give people the example of like if Shakespeare heard Yas Queen now,
Oh, I love that.
Shakespeare would pass out. So it's almost like even like for example Dante, who made like the
Mm,
Italian modern Italian language,
yeah.
it's so different now. So I feel like we always have to incorporate the fact that it will always change. And
Mm,
maybe a language guide that was like released in 2011
mhm.
is super super regressive now
Yeah.
when it from like a model lens. So yeah, that's exactly what I think. The like just reiterates the fact that it is flexible and it is always changing.
Mm. Oh, I mean, on those points, I think Shakespeare, I think the idea of having like Yas Queen in like Romeo and Juliet is hilarious. Um, Dante is an interesting one that you mentioned, just sometimes, wrote in a Florentine dialect. So from Florence, Florence is often called the cradle of Italian because, when Dante was writing, he was writing in Italian, kind of Florentine Italian, in a literary context when the majority of books being written at that time that were literary or technical were all written in Latin. So Dante's push against the kind of, you know, what was happening around him was to say, okay, well, I can make something that's just as good, that's just as important, that's just as powerful in Italian rather than in Latin. This allows for more people to read it, etc. And he wrote in his own, in his own form of Italian. Italy is a very highly regionalized country, so it has a large number of dialects, etc. And so Dante's, push to write in Italian, and then it was so well adopted and so highly, praised. I think I sort of like when I was doing. Sorry, I am digressing. I did my master's in Italian Renaissance studies, so this is something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about. But just very briefly, so Dante is one of the only scholars to have had literary criticism, so people writing about his books basically from as soon as they were published all the way until today. There's like 700-800 years of scholarship on Dante, and many people basically say that he was the one that defined which dialect in Italy would become the main kind of standard Italian. Anyway, so what was really interesting there is that if it had been something else, if it had been a different, if Italian had grown in a different fashion to become the standard, then it would have been completely different today as a kind of standard language. So, the fact that there is so much variation within language, at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, is expressive, I think, of this flexibility that is required. And anyone who is looking to introduce more inclusive elements into corporate comms has to be ready to be flexible. Um, oh, digress onto Dante. Fabulous, fabulous. Okay, let's go through some of the questions that have come through on Slido before we give you a practical set of tips around trans non-binary inclusive language specifically. First question, has language affected your decision to come out, whether a positive, e.g. someone speaking inclusively, or less so, feeling that you have to correct an assumption? That's an interesting one. Yeah, have I come out at work? Trey, what are your thoughts? Have you come out at work because you felt there was a safe space to come out, or did you have to come out as a reaction to someone representing you essentially?
I think it was like more of a safe space rather
Mm,
than misrepresentation because obviously I didn't really feel safe to be
right.
completely me like back home. And even like when my parents really like they were very stunned by the he they, and they were like, oh, what is happening
Mm,
here? And they were a bit, oh, I don't understand, but they were fine with it. But yeah, even like trying to translate that directly to like my cultural background to my parents, it was very hard. And I think they still have like a very like tough time digesting it. But I feel like I just show them cool gods who are androgynous, and I'm like, here you go. This person is super cool.
Here's the precedent.
Yeah. So I think that in that way, like the Hindu culture really helps me out.
Mm.
You had too many cool gods. So once you show them someone a picture of God, they're generally okay with it. So I guess.
Hey, I mean, there's an element of inclusivity there. There's this idea of like allyship and role modeling, right? If you can say, here's this role model who happens to have expressed multiple genders, why can't I do that too? So I think it's really interesting that that example translates so easily into the kind of diversity, equity, inclusion space, right? And so the importance of role models, the importance of cultural nuance and sensitivity, the importance of asking, not assuming, and I think it's for me, I think I definitely have done both. I've definitely come out in environments at work where I felt safe to, and I just sort of naturally said, "Oh, my partner, he does this," and there I've gendered him already, but I did so on my own terms. When someone has said to me, "Oh, what does your partner do?" that invites me in to talk about my partner. People have said, "Oh, what does your girlfriend do?" And then I do have to then I say, it's an interesting one because that does put me in a risky position. I think this person has, you know, has has acknowledged that definitely, which is that I have to do a risk analysis. Am I in a safe enough environment to actually say no? My partner is a man or identifies as male. I have the onus is on me. Inclusive language is about creating a space that doesn't force me to fill it or that allows me to fill it kind of myself. And that it's inviting in rather than having to fight back, I think is probably how I would express it here. But I think this person, yeah, thank you for asking that question because that's a perfect example of why inclusive language matters, because there is that power of liberation there. I felt liberated in saying. So, that's that back to that quote at the beginning, language is power, the power of potential liberation. So it does feel very liberating to come out. It is National Coming Out Day. Um, so yeah, I think definitely all of that plays into inclusive language here. What else have people said? I use someone's name if I know it to refer to them when I don't know their pronouns. Yeah, I mean that's completely agree. Asking there's interesting things about names, right? And this is partly why many people choose to put their pronouns on their bio or their email signature or their LinkedIn, because just by seeing a name written down, often you don't know what the underlying, what the person's gender identity is, especially if it's a name from somewhere you're not, familiar with the naming conventions, or if it's a gender neutral name, like I don't know, Alex is a classic example. If you just see Alex on a piece of paper, I could be Alexandra or Alexander, So there is value in specificity, I think, and inclusive language creates space for that specificity. We've got a Q&A question in Zoom. Do you feel like all languages will embrace inclusive pronouns? A great question. I might pause on that one if that's okay, and we'll come back to that when I show a slide later about inclusive language around the world. I think that was the last question I'll take at the moment. What about terms like a gay being reclaimed by certain queer people? Is this only acceptable for those it's been directed at, or all queer people? A very good question and a pertinent one, because I do describe my kind of closest group of friends, all of whom happen to be part of the LGBTQ plus community, as the gays. That's the name on my phone for the group that I have. So I do actually fully appreciate that this question has been asked by someone who shares my worldview, which is that words like that can be reclaimed, but I'm doing so and I'm directing how that is being reclaimed. The same with the word queer. Many people on this call may go, "Oh, I'm queer is not a word that anyone should be using. That's derogatory." Yes, absolutely. Historically, it's been used as a derogatory term, has been reclaimed by the community. So we have taken ownership of it again. And it's become more of a term that associates us with a community. You talk about the queer community that acknowledges people's different gender identities, expressions, sexualities, life choices, how they choose to live their lives, as well as their identities. And it often is a catch-all term, an inclusive term, that has been reclaimed, particularly by younger LGBTQ plus folks. But it's still how it's delivered. It can still be a slur. It doesn't, just because it's reclaimed doesn't mean it stops being a slur. The same with using the gays. I refer to my friends as the gays. But in certain instances, it is probably better to, particularly in a corporate context, to use that person-centered language from the previous set of principles. Anyway, that's a few thoughts. Trey, any other thoughts from you on those questions?
No, I mean, I completely agree. Just I feel like it's the context again, and obviously you have more um even linguistic power in using such terms when you are part of the community. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a very big difference. And obviously there's context within groups and how the groups operate.
Yeah,
And yeah, I feel like it depends on the context more than anything. But I would normally suggest like people who are outside the community to not use it because again,
yeah.
it's not person centered.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
And inclusive language, I would maybe say actually inclusive communication can be built on that second principle of asking. So if you're not part of the community, the way you ask questions can invite conversations that are very inclusive. So if you're not sure about queer as a word that I can use or can't use, or in what context, I've seen corporate comms that have talked about, we've had a queer story hour, or we've got a queer book club in our company. Oh, okay, that's feels quite progressive linguistically. But if there was someone in that organization who said, I'm not sure how to use this word, and I have a responsibility that involves communicating and may need to use this word, taking ownership of that question and being brave and saying, hey, I know, Alex, I know you're part of the LGBTQ plus community. People, can I just ask you a question about queer? Oh, sorry, I hope that's not an offensive term, but I've seen it used in other contexts. Do you know anything about how that's used? And that's a very safe way for me to either say, oh yeah, absolutely, let me tell you, or no, I don't actually. If it ever happens to you, send them our way. If you're not sure how to tackle that, LGBT Great is here for that kind of reason as well as the others. Okay, cool. I'm going to move on because we've got 15 minutes left. Um, Again, there's a lot of text on this slide, but I wanted to give you a sense of what our approach is hit throughout the guide. There's two parts of inclusive language I wanted to just spotlight, although this is not the only practical tips that we can discuss. The first is around the use of non-gendered collective nouns and terminology. This is very relevant in in any kind of conversation, whether that's in email conversation or more face to face, etc. And then the second one, we've kind of touched on it already, is around assuming someone's pronouns. Shrey, is there anything you want to jump in to sharing on this before we go through this in a bit more detail?
Yes, thank you. My mouse stopped working. I think this is where I was using my code for. I was waiting for it.
Okay, great.
But like there's this linguist, a French postmodern linguist called Jacques Derrida, who's one of my favorite
Mm-hmm.
philosophers generally. And he has this quote that says, one utilizes language for action, movement, thought, reflection, consciousness, unconsciousness, experience, and effectivity. And how that applies to me personally is that I feel like pronouns, for example, just a small change, especially in English, are a direct way of affirming my own identity because
Mm-hmm.
it is a linguistic acknowledgement of my deviation from the normative binary. And these acknowledgements form such important factors in the formation of your identity with yourself as well as the world.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone says that, I feel like really seen and heard.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like that's exactly what I mean. And Derrida said it beautifully because he was like the god of deconstruction. But yeah, I feel like that's how it's very important to me, especially in this language. But when I go
Mm-hmm.
back to another language, which we'll talk about later, it's kind of different. And there's also like a lot of studies about how behaviors and characteristics are slightly different as you switch between languages. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something generally I've been thinking about. But yeah, in English especially, if someone doesn't assume my pronouns, just asks me, it's such a empowering thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all of that big build up of what we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes kind of boils down to some quite practical, quite simple things in many ways. So I think it's important to acknowledge that inclusive language is rooted in a complex discussion of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, well-being, but fundamentally is just about using specific words, avoiding others, consciously thinking about what you're saying, how you're saying it, and who you're saying it to, focusing on who you're speaking with or about and trying to understand their worldview, their perspective, and their context and their lived experience, and using language that empowers them, centers them, acknowledges them, validates them. I think that's kind of the big secret of inclusive language comms. Um, we've got Alex saying you include pronouns. Exactly. I think this is really key. It's about trying to, in instances that you can affect, you can change, being a bit more inclusive. Instead of the ladies and gentlemen, hi everyone, hi folks. That gives space, whether it's conscious or unconscious, to everyone who doesn't identify as being a gentleman or a lady. And that's, we have Shrey on the line who is in that group. So if I say, hi, ladies and gents, at the top of this call, Shrey is immediately excluded. And that is fine. But it's not fine, really. It's manageable and digestible at the first time it happens, potentially. But if that happens every day, in every comms, in every conversation, it, is it'll be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It will be the something that you can't really get over. And it will have an impact on your well-being, on your productivity, on your feeling of psychological safety and belonging. And we know, if anyone's ever looked at the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's loads of stuff out there. We try and not talk about the business case as we try and talk about the human case where possible. But the business case is that improved psychological safety results in improved productivity, which results in improved top and bottom lines. Boom. Great, excellent. There's the business case for DE&I work. Inclusive language then. Inclusive language is one part of improving psychological safety and well-being, which improves productivity, which improves top and bottom line growth. So, if you ever have to talk about it in those terms, boil it down into that, then that's why inclusive language matters, because it fundamentally is one of the key parts of boosting and building psychologically safe environments. I hope that you will all be saying, great, but let's talk about the human reasons for doing this, and that, rather than just the top bottom line growth, although that's good too. So that's kind of how we approach sharing some of the tips and tricks and practical elements in the guide. You'll see that there's areas that create barriers to inclusion, and aspects that promote inclusion, and then we've got some commentary underneath there as well, which hopefully across the different sections will be useful for you. Okay, I can see we've got some. Thank you everyone for just take a moment to say thank you for sharing all of your comments in both the chat here and in Slido. It's great to see that this conversation is clearly resonating with you. So thank you for being so open with your stories. Okay, 2 more slides for you, and then I will let you go. I've talked a lot about global languages. This is one of my favorite slides. I love talking about this. We've had a couple of questions around, what about in other languages? How can we be inclusive? Is there a one size fits all approach? Will all languages embrace inclusive, language and pronouns and those sorts of things? And I think it goes back to that conversation earlier around language being flexible and changing. I think naturally all languages will move to a point where the LGBTQ plus community is included and has ways to express themselves. The LGBTQ plus community is everywhere. We're in every country. We speak every language. So, there is someone who will need to express their identity in that language. So naturally, that it will force or will naturally come to the point where there is terminology, there are modes of speech, there are patterns of speech that are inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community, and in contexts or content, it'll be important to share some of those. This slide outlines a few approaches that languages take to this type of inclusion. I'll start with Spanish there, which I'm sure some of you have seen the X as a kind of a letter that denotes O or A for those Spanish speakers, I'm sure you're familiar with some of that. We've had Latin X. It's not always preferred, but in many instances it is something that is used. And it basically stands for either an O or an a masculine or a feminine ending. So what we have here is an orthographic, so a letter, a specific letter that denotes a specific, aspect of identity. In this case, either male or female. There are aspects here where non-binary folks are not necessarily explicitly included, which is why we have the addition of other letters, so like the @ symbol, as well as additional pronouns like L that you can see there, which is a specific non-binary pronoun because it is ostensibly and clearly non-binary gendered of male or female. So orthography, so specific words and letters, so lexicon for specific words or orthography for specific letters is one approach. In Swedish, there's hen, which is a gender neutral pronoun. So again, using specific words. Arabic takes a slightly different approach in that it uses specific verb forms, which is the dual. So they can, you change parts of the verb to express specific aspects that are gender neutral or gender inclusive. There's in Hebrew, there are grammatical aspects of adding both endings. So in Hebrew, you add parts, specific letters onto the end of specific words, and that expresses particular gender identities or parts or determiners. But if you put both, then that means all, which I think is a kind of really good kind of way. So there's a kind of conjugated verb element. So there's specific words, specific letters, specific verb forms, and then in Chinese and Japanese, specific characters. So specific kanji to convey a specific gendered or non-gendered or gender inclusive aspect. I talked about Japanese. I think Japanese is fascinating. And in Japanese, you have a spectrum, which is an alternative approach where you have specific words that are set on a specific spectrum, from ore, the hypermasculine form of I, so very masculine, to boku, which is a kind of masculine inflected way of saying I, often used by young boys, teens. You'll see this a lot. I would probably because I don't feel super hyper masculine all the time. Sometimes I do. Ore is probably what you hear in an office quite a lot, but you would also hear boku. If you got jibun, which is kind of another form of the impersonal. So watashi basically is used by both genders and is gender neutral. So it doesn't have an inherent sense of gender associated with it. All the way across to atashi, which is a kind of hyper feminized way of talking about language. So those are just a few ways in which kind of gender and gender inclusive language is approached around the world. So verb forms, specific words, specific letters, changes to grammar, the addition of specific characters in kind of character-based languages, quite different to just saying they, them, right? So obviously, that's included there. But English approaches it in one way, but global languages are very diverse in their approach to inclusion here. I've got a specific example I can share, but Shrey, I know you and I have been talking about Hindi and Bengali, so I'd love to hear a little bit from you about how, your experience really.
No, yeah, thank you. That was very helpful because I don't know that much about these languages, but I do know a bit about Hindi and Bengali because I speak it and I've spoken it since I was a child. But Hindi, and I speak Hindi when I'm back home, but I also speak Bengali. My dad's from Bengal. But in Hindi, every noun has a gender and every adjective has a gender as well. So you have to change the sentence itself to match the gender of the subject, which is very interesting because in English, what you just do is you can change the pronoun from he, she, they, but that doesn't really work in Hindi because it's almost like you have non-gendered pronouns in terms of like he, she, they. But what changes is, for example, in English, you would say he is good, but in Hindi, you would say wo acha hai. So um the letter that changes in when you change it to wo achi hai, basically she is good, is like the single letter that you just described in Spanish.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
basically that's just a subtle shift. But what is very interesting is when it goes to Bengali, we are gender neutral, which is very cool.
Mm,
So it's the same for everything. So what ami bhalo achi, ami tumi bhalo acho, it stays the same regardless of your gender.
hmm
And another Bhojpuri language, which is basically like a sister language to Hindi, but slightly different again. It also uses like gender neutral ways to incorporate everyone, and that's what Hindi is doing. Basically, it's trying to take bits and pieces of Bhojpuri or Bengali or like the
mm,
ways that they construct their sentences to make Hindi more inclusive. But and the most interesting part I feel is that everything comes from Sanskrit. So the
mm,
like the mother language is Sanskrit, and Sanskrit's it has like masculine, feminine, and gender neutral terminology for every noun. So it changes very like it's completely different from Hindi and Bengali in that
hmm
sense in terms of like the gendered nouns. So I feel like even that just shows that over like how languages evolve, even like the daughter languages change so much over just like what 3, 4,000, 5,000 years. And yeah, I find it fascinating. So yeah.
And I'm sure you won't mind me saying, as a non-binary genderqueer person, how do you then shift from that gendered, experience of Hindi to a gender neutral Bengali? As a person who's has this sense of their own identity, how do you navigate those two languages that have very different approaches?
Yeah. No, because you can also misgender yourself in Hindi, which is so
That's
interesting. You
hilarious.
can't do that. And that's what I'm trying to shift because
Mm,
my entire life I've been like using like the masculine gendered like noun construction, like the sentence construction. And now it's so hard to like shift that.
mm,
And there's obviously like the another third form, which is like the pluralistic they, and
yeah.
that changes like the sentence itself. But that almost sounds grammatically wrong, and that's what like because so much LGBTQ plus discourse in India is focused in English, so that's what
Mm,
they're trying to incorporate in Hindi to make like the grammatically wrong actually grammatically right,
yeah.
and that's what I'm trying to do like subconsciously as well. I'm practicing.
That's really
Um,
wow.
yeah,
You're living proof of that descriptivist, flexible, approach to language. It feels wrong to say, but you
yeah,
know that it is right because it
yeah.
reflects you.
Yeah.
Um, that's funny. The only other we've got 2 minutes left. I'll give a quick anecdote and then I'll wrap up. So when I was on my year abroad in Italy, I had a met a load of people, including a trans woman, and she said that for her, coming out, it's National Coming Out Day, was something that she had to do when she spoke because of the linguistic aspects of Italian forced her to have to come out. So in Italian, in the past tense, if you say I went to the cinema or whatever, I went to the shops, for me, I identify as a man, I would say sono andato, I went. If I identified as female, I would say sono andata. This is a grammatical way of reflecting your internal sense of yourself externally. Obviously, if you're transitioning, you may be expressing your gender externally in one way, but actually, throughout that transition, you're moving into a space where you may want to actually use the language that correlates with your gender identity. Wouldn't that be good? But you have to consciously do that. And so she said that, for people that didn't know she was transitioning or, early on in that transition, she had to come out every single time she said that she did something in the past tense every single time. Just imagine the level of like strain that must put on someone, to actually have to say, well, I went to the shops. Oh, and yeah, sorry, I do have to then tell you that I'm trans because I've just told you by using that word. And that was she told me it was a very conscious choice for her to shift. And as soon as she shifted, she then had to own that coming out experience every single time she met a new person. So that I just thought was fascinating. And so, the experience of LGBTQ plus people around the world is influenced by the languages that they speak. I think is kind of my take home. Okay, we're at time. Oh God. Right. Thank you everyone for your time, attention, and for all of your questions. In terms of kind of next steps, the guide will be available and shared with you all next week. If you would like a specific training session on LGBTQ plus inclusive language, we are offering that in kind of more detail than we've gone through today with specific exercises. For any corporate clients on the line, LGBT Great members, this would constitute one of your training credits, but is completely included within that. And for any non-LGBTQ LGBT Great clients, you to get in contact with me and I can give you pricing on what that would be. We also are CPD accredited, so this would be part of a CPD accredited course on language, if that is of interest to you and your organization. And then finally, please get involved. I know you all speak different languages, and we are basically doing a call to action, an expression of interest for some working groups looking at inclusive language around the world. And I'll be sharing the form for all of you to be able to fill in to get involved in that. And they'll be taking part in the rest of this year with a view that the LGBT Great global toolkit, the global language toolkit, will be made available at some point early next year. So stay tuned for all of that. Last point, people are saying recording. Yes, the recording of this will be put up on our public YouTube channel. And any other questions you have, do drop me a line directly, me or Shreyas. And I know, Luke, I know you've been in the chat function. Thank you so much. We will get in touch. Well, sorry, you can get in touch with us if you need anything. And otherwise, thank you very much and wishing you all a great rest of the day. I will close the session now. The technology. Oh, right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Catch you later.